So to what extent does that problem that occurred in the 1970s influence current decisions in Zambia? Any others? Okay, well I think I don't see any other hands raised, so I think that I'll thank the speaker, Miles, for that very illuminating account of developments in Zambia.
Shall I come back on that one question?
Oh yes, of course.
No, sure, that's fine. What I hope, I'm again frustrated that I can't be here, but I hope this contributes to the development of a kind of comparative analysis, particularly with the situation in South Africa. Briefly on the question, it's a very important sort of point. With the nationalisation that occurred then, the companies had all the cards. The state was relatively new. Many of the officials that had appointed to run its mines department and industry, mines department had come from the companies. They had the company's interest largely at heart. The companies had all the information. The companies suckered the state into overpaying, massively overpaying, for an industry they knew was about to go into massive loss making, because they could see that there was a crisis of overproduction looming. So one of the questions when states negotiate with companies about these things is the information they have at their fingertips. You know, companies will always have a bit more money to pay for legal advice and economic advice, but states and the communities around them need to be ready for that. It's also that the state acted in its own interest, not really, there wasn't a popular move or a popular push for nationalisation. Most mine workers believed this would just make the states more powerful over them. So it's always a question, it's not, you know, I would share the sympathies about privatisation of the platinum industry here because of the specificities of it. So I think I can see the case for that. But it's always, I would say, as a kind of last point, you know, it's the nature of the nationalisation process that takes place rather than a principle of nationalisation itself. Just as a final plug, I should say that if you are interested in more of this, there is a book that I co-edited with Alistair Fraser called Zambia, Mining and Neoliberalism, where we go into a lot more of the detail of this kind of debate. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Sorry that I just tried to stop you from asking the question. Have you got any questions?
I know, exactly.
Okay, we're now going to have a 20-minute talk by Richard Saunders on policy, practice and realities of indigenization in Zimbabwe's mineral sector.
I'd like to reiterate Miles's thanks to Gavin and SWOP for this really fascinating colloquium so far. I'm sure there's more to come. It's been very useful for me in terms of informing my thinking about the debates which are ongoing and reaching fever pitch in Zimbabwe right now around resource nationalism. In Zimbabwe, we don't call it resource nationalism per se. In the absence of a coherent minerals policy, and in the absence of a coherence between specific minerals frameworks and laws, in the absence of uniformity of objectives amongst different state institutions, and in the increasing absence of professional, juridical, predictably administered minerals regime in Zimbabwe, we can't really say that there is a specific minerals policy, but I think in this instance, in the instance of the last year especially, indigenization stands in as a proxy for ZANU's resource nationalist policies. And it's a really problematic proxy, because indigenization in Zimbabwe, which has a long history going back at least 20 years in this current era, indigenization is many things at once, and often there's a blurring of the boundaries between its different components. Indigenization is a policy framework which has taken many iterations over the last 20 years. It's also, of course, since 2008, a legal entity. It's through the National Indigenization Economic Empowerment Act and its many general notices and statutory instruments which have given effect to it. It's a policy wedge issue in the last 2 years particularly, but longer, and a campaign issue. In other words, it's a basis, it provides a framework for populist rhetoric in Zim. And furthermore, and very importantly, underlying all this, indigenization is a source of accumulation. It's a point of extraction, it's a point of political and highly partisan patronage, and it's a point of political power manifested in unpredictable and ad hoc ways. So, in sum, I guess we would say indigenization as it stands is quite a dog's breakfast of things in terms of its form and content and the different directions it takes. It's very messy, it's complex and it's evolving, and it's more or less now at the center of political economy and policy-making debates. And this is a point I want to underscore at the very beginning of this talk, and because it really provides the framework for our research and in Zimbabwe and our current debates. There was no other kind of policy intervention that I can think of which has had as comprehensive and profound effect upon the way in which the key stakeholders in the economy now engage with each other: state, business, donors, civil society. Indigenization, for all of its warts and all of its beauty, in terms of its current profile, has forced, like no other policy in the last 33 years of independence, a direct, engaged, meaningful response from capital and from business. There's been a scramble, but there's also been a new thinking around what it means to be an economic player, what it means to be an economic citizen of Zimbabwe, how states can discipline foreign and local capital. And businesses had to respond creatively to this in new ways. And if you want, the center of gravity of debate, the center of gravity of thinking, even on the part of business, has shifted with indigenization. It's also shifted, by the way, in the state. There is certainly no uniformity or unanimity within the state and within the ruling party of what indigenization means, what it should mean, and what guidelines it offers for a way forward as Zimbabwe recovers from this disastrous last decade of the 2000s. Indigenization is also framing the politics of the possible in the language of the IMF, and this is important, and other international donors. This is important in light of the fact that Zimbabwe has begun to re-engage with the Paris Club. In June of this year, government signed or initialed a letter of intent for a staff monitoring program of the IMF, and which opens up new questions about how an austerity package can be placed on top of an indigenization policy and set of statutes as we see. And just as importantly, indigenization has opened the door to a new kind of engagement by civil society, a door that was shut at least 12, 13 years ago by the militantization of the Zanu state to begin with, and which has remained more or less firmly shut since then. Today is the second day in Harare of the alternative civil society mining Indaba, and I can assure you that the kinds of things which are on the agenda of that Indaba, which brings together traditional leaders, trade unionists, displaced people from the diamond fields, mining houses, the Chamber of Mines, and international players, organized by civil society. I can assure you that the agenda of discussion today is miles away from where it was 10 years ago, when the focus was on how to make yourself more attractive to investors and how to solve the power and fuel crisis. Today on the agenda in Harare, they're discussing environmental damage and costs that should be imposed on companies, the role of the state in disciplining companies, the role of the state in ensuring that CSR is delivered and that it's done evenly without patronage and without partisanship, and a lot of other issues in this regard too, including an open dialogue with the parts of the African mining vision. It's a really engaging and open space for a number of players. Some don't welcome it, most do. And in that sense, indigenization is always in the background of our new discussion of what the politics of the possible and economics of the possible look like in Zimbabwe today. Something has fundamentally changed with indigenization. I just want to underscore the point. I think this is a positive change. It's a necessary beginning for talking about what nationalist resources, not nationalization, but resource nationalism looks like in Zimbabwe. It's not a complete closure and if a settlement on what resource nationalism might look like, but it's an important and necessary beginning point of a new kind of debate with new kinds of players coming onto the terrain. There's a lot to unpack, and I probably have about 10 minutes left by now, but I'd just like to briefly outline what I want to talk about for the remaining time. I want to begin by talking about briefly what this new indigenization policy is about, which has been seen as so controversial and radical. I don't think it necessarily is. I want to look for some experiences, actual practical outcomes in terms of what indigenization has promised, particularly in the mineral sector, and what the outcomes are that we see with the restructuring of some of the major mining houses that we've seen so far in the last 2 years. And I want to look at some of the responses and engagement from below, as there's a continuing discussion of how to make indigenization and national transfer assets more accountable, more participatory, and more equitable. If you want principles, practices, and politics which are emerging from minerals indigenization. We could say, in brief, it's a long story, but to make it very short, indigenization in Zimbabwe over the last 20 years has been very much a lens into the shifting balance of forces within the state, and particularly within ZANU-PF. In the early 1990s, under ISAC, Zimbabwe's form of structural adjustment, we saw the emergence in response to dispossession by trade of Indigenous Business Development Center and affirmative action groups. Various elements of African business communities were lobbying against the worst predations of structural adjustment in terms of knocking them out of business. That kind of lobbying led to a first wave of indigenization discussion around joint ventures, the need for the state to intervene, access to soft capital, and various forms of protection in markets, most of which was not very successful. As ESAC, the structural adjustment, evolved into crisis and the capital shortage in the late 1990s, we see ZANU finally responding with a set of policy principles, the first of 3 policy frameworks around indigenization in 6 years. And it was a formally, kind of nominally, quite unchallenging policy framework, talking about government procurement, minimum government procurement, special allocations at the Reserve Bank for small businessmen, so on and so forth. As the crisis in Zimbabwe, as we know, got worse in the late 1990s after the involvement in the DRC, the donor boycott, and a financial crisis which extended and worsened after the fast-track land redistribution in the 2000s, we saw radicalization of that framework slowly but surely to include things like the transfer of privatized assets without payment, without compensation, and so on and so forth. By the crisis, the super hyperinflationary crisis of the mid-2000s, another revision of indigenization came in advance of the 2008 election, and it was the kind of framework which evolved into the current law, the Indigenization Economic Empowerment Act, which was passed in 2007 and gazetted, put into practice in 2008. That act, ironically, is much less comprehensive and much more narrowly focused than many of the more broad-based integrated frameworks that we saw before. It's an act which is more or less focused on equity transfers and ownerships, both to individuals, to state warehousing organizations, and to community and employee share ownership schemes. The 2008 Act is best known for requiring within a 4-year period a 51% transfer of equity in all foreign-owned companies and in Zimbabwean companies which are controlled or owned by so-called non-indigenous Zimbabweans. There are other standard elements of this package: 51% transfer, the setting up of a National Indigenization Economic Empowerment Board and Fund to warehouse and manage these shares and transfer capital, a second related pillar of ESOCs and CSOTs, community and employee share ownerships, and the specification of reserve sectors in Zimbabwe, 9 different reserve sectors, mostly services in which foreigners are not allowed to play a role. They include things like entertainment, basic services, printing, publishing, things like this. So a fairly standard set of packages, but what really sets it apart from other kinds of indigenization laws and programs that we've seen in Zimbabwe is the short time frame and the absolute definition of 51% transfer and under the discretion of a minister without much oversight from any government state structures like the board itself, which is appointed by the Minister of Youth Development, Indigenization and Economic Empowerment. The appearance of the IEE, the Indigenization and Economic Empowerment Act, is one of being rapid, transformative, redistributive in language, and integrated in its approach to enhancing, as Zano calls it, economic sovereignty. But in practice, the Act is much less transformative than it claims to be, and it's challenged by a number of factors. One, it doesn't really talk about different sectoral linkages between equity transfers and other important ways of managing investment. For example, the FDI Act, the Zimbabwe Investment Agency, regulations around small businesses, around employment creation, Ministry of Labor. There are no specified linkages within the framework or the Act around these kinds of intergovernmental linkages and consultations which would be necessary to have a comprehensive policy. Another key weakness are the actual legal foundations of the Act itself, which many lawyers have said is the most incoherently drafted and most rushedly drafted legislation that they've seen in 33 years in Zimbabwe. We have, although threats of using the full wrath of the law to compel companies to divest of shares, there are no penalties specified in the Act for not doing so. Compliance with the Act doesn't mean actually giving up shares. Compliance means submitting an indigenous implementation plan, but not actually carrying it out. If there's a refusal from companies to come back to the minister with acceptable plan, there are no penalties for that. There is nothing stated in the law about how institutionally one moves forward. Far beyond this, there is no specification of how and the mechanisms for how shares are actually transferred, why they would go into a fund or into some other sectoral holding agency for transferred shares, what to do if companies refuse, how does one value the shares. This is not done unilaterally by the minister. How companies should divide shares amongst a mass shareholding that need to be seeded without issuing new shares. How to keep track of shares between indigenous and non-indigenous shareholders, even assuming that all of the current shareholders are non-indigenous, maybe they aren't. How does one track that? There's no mechanism for this. And how does one, in the end, value shares that have been sequestered, if you want, from the normal shareholding? Those are legal foundations which have undermined, if you want, the effectiveness, the coherence, and the enforceability of the Act. The challenge to transformation has also come from companies and from ZANU itself. Many of the companies, knowing that indigenization was coming, particularly in the mining sector, preempted indigenization by signing their own contracts and ceding shares to shareholder trusts or ceding land, as in the case of Zimplats. ZANU at the same time, and those in government, have been very accommodating in some instances of companies which have come discreetly, privately, outside the state bureaucracy of mining institutions like the ZNBC and the NMCZ, marketers and producers. ZANU has been quite accommodating in actually doing deals behind closed doors without informing the state itself. All of this points to a very serious problem, which has been highlighted not so much in the bad contract signed by the state with companies like Zimplats and Anki, which is an Anglo-American platinum company, but in Chiadzwa, where diamonds, artisanal diamonds are done. The state has a very, very serious lack of capacity, broken connections between different institutions of the states, and an almost complete breakdown in checks and balances and supervisory coordination over how these mining companies have proposed indigenization. In reality, what has happened is that the government has abstained from adopting a more proactive, organized, developmental restructuring vision for the sector, especially the mining sector, and has actually gone to companies to ask them to do the work for them. These are the basic rules. You figure it out. Come back to us with the plan that you think we'll like. That's been the basic attitude. Government has yielded a huge amount of policy-making space to private companies and to the larger mining houses in particular. And government has also been completely made vulnerable by the fact that the funds for the National Empowerment Fund for purchasing shares where they're not seeded is almost empty. It's, as far as we know, we have no idea what's in it, but it's understood that it's almost zero capitalization. This has led to kind of an ad hoc engagement in the mining sector. Rather than developing a coordinated approach, we have an ad hoc approach. And of course the mining sector is one of the first targets of indigenization because it's one of the few players left standing in the wake of the economic crisis of the 2000s. At Zimplats, the Implats is a company and large platinum producer, the largest employer in Zimbabwe. We see how this kind of ad hoc and vulnerability of the weaknesses state has played out. There has been a 10% ceding of shares to an employee share ownership fund. There has been another 10% ceded to a community development trust, and there's been 31% made available to the state for acquisition at market prices at almost $800 million. The problem is, in the case of both the employee and community shares, they're bought by dividends. They have to be paid for by dividends, and until they are entirely paid, there is no ownership of those shares in the hands of the trusts. Dividends is a problem because Zimplats hasn't declared dividends since 2006. The same is the case with the much larger, substantial 31% which has been ceded to government. It does not come under control until it's fully paid for. And the conditions of the continuing donor boycott against Zimbabwe and the undercapitalization, zero capitalization of the National Empowerment Fund, there will never be adequate resources to buy up that 31% shareholding. What does this mean? It means that we're unlikely in the case of Zimbabwe's largest and one of the most profitable companies in Zimbabwe, which has pulled down $1 billion in revenue in the last 11 years, we're unlikely to see majority share ownership. We're unlikely to see any forms of continuing CSR because CSR budgets from Zimplats have been rolled into these share ownership schemes, which are going to be paid out over time. And we are not going to see, if you want, a transformation of the way in which management at Zimplats work. This has been a good deal for Zimplats, which has locked down its access to ground, good ground, which has locked down its access to the excellent tax breaks it received as part of the investment of $1.1 billion, and it has locked down the agreement that it is fully indigenized and empowered and community-oriented. My time is up. I would go on to talk more, but maybe in questions about diamonds and the particular problem of diamonds. The fact that an adverse report in Parliament, a report unlike any I've seen in 33 years of parliamentary reports by the Mining Portfolio Committee, has stated chapter and verse the way in which the state has been criminalized, undermined, sidelined, and in other words, made obsolete by large-scale mining companies, by criminal gangs working around diamonds, and by the power of South Africa's considerable platinum industry. It's a report which was released in June. I would recommend it to anybody for a shocking and incredible read of how states get undermined and destroyed by mining. And my only regret is that Edward Chinori Chininga, who is the Member of Parliament, ZANU-PF Member of Parliament, who is chair of that committee, was tragically killed in an accident 1 week after the report was released. We owe a lot to Edward, and I would recommend that report to all of you, and hope that the debate, which started with Edward inside ZANU in the Portfolio Committee and further, is continued in his absence.
Thank you very much indeed. Right, now I'm going to move straight on to the third and final paper, which comes to us from Colombia, I believe, via Skype. Cesar, are you hearing me? Is everything sorted? You've got 20 minutes. to do your presentation starting now.
Okay. Thank you everyone. Thank you in particular to Gavin, Carl, Abby, and SWOP. I'm sorry that I can't be there, but for visa issues, it became impossible for me to make it. But last year, I attended a conference on mining, actually, that was right after Marikana. It was a very beautiful seminar room. I see that you guys are in a different room now. But I'm glad that at least I can participate via Skype. So what I'll do in the next 20 minutes is two things. One is to try to give you a sense of what the key issues are around mining and mining conflicts in Latin America, and then offer a couple of ideas about comparisons and differences between Africa and Latin America that explain why some of the political, social, and economic issues have commonalities, but also have difference among that. And I'll use this PowerPoint presentation. I thought since Skype makes interaction difficult, I'd use